This is a list of what I call societal degradations, and I believe it especially took off since 1951 with the advent of Thorazine, which was the first lobotomy drug, as I call it. And prior to this, the greatest tools for control were imprisonment or execution or exile. And these were all very obvious and often irreversible, but not with Thorazine. Thorazine was also different than an ice pick lobotomy because ice pick lobotomies were unreversible and very invasive, whereas a pill can be stopped its usage of, except for some earlier side effects, like with Thorazine, the tardive dyskinesia issues, for instance. But later, this was largely eliminated, and all the more then these drugs took sway, and all their lesser powerful aspects, such as the minor tranquilizers we call Xanax, etc., Klonopin, and what they call antidepressants. So that's a fascinating topic right there. Then I'll just go down a list here. Free will or choice has been taught as a matter of course, and, well, a preferable concept for many. Those in the rural areas throughout the world have always come to grips with this much better than those in urban areas. And those with a predilection to want to think in terms of free will or magical thinking or pulling a rabbit out of a hat or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps or doing something with no resources, basically, or ignoring constraints. It's all too easy to market the concept to people, and that's exactly what happens. And people are all too willing and likely to hitch onto this, just like getting a taste of crack cocaine and then not being able to get off. Or as per Freud saying, once you taste sex, that's the end of your education. And this then has been inculcated strongly in our Western societies as per its jurisprudence system and religion. Alternative points of view, thus the point of view alternatively taught by only a few philosophers, off the top of my head, Leibniz. And I'm thinking also in modern times there have been other books written. Ortega has taken up the cause. So we have a jurisprudence system where those with excellent legal representation can have their case argued in terms of determinism as per the nuts and bolts of how things happened, such that they ended up in court in the first place or ended up in life where some other people got hurt. Whereas the poor people of the world, so to speak, the lawyer resourceless, including pro bono lawyers assigned to them and such, are at the mercy of having to say that they chose to do what they did and must pay the consequences. And the lawyers don't have the acumen to argue a nuts and bolts, complex argument. The same could be said then for telling certain people that they're mentally ill, when in fact there's a long chain of events, and that it almost never has anything to do with a brain malady per se. It's rather like having a computer problem and saying that the computer has a mental illness, so just throw it out, instead of delving into the complexities that might take hours or maybe a ton of hours if it's a bank computer system and you must have that data back. That then spins into the next topic here, the genetic theory of, quote, mental illness, and an additional flair here, the whole concept of mental illness, as opposed to several factors. Jordan Peterson put out a little 2-minute video on his take of mental illness as inability to handle complexity and then having a blowout at some weak point in us. But I would say, moreover, that the 500 odd diagnoses, more and more each year, which Thomas Szasz says is over-medicalizing, and Francis Schaeffer wrote a book, in fact, after being on the DSM committee, maybe heading it, Saving Normal. And there are others too who have spoke about it. Garrison Keillor has done at least one video in which he mentioned this overarching and growing medicalization of weaknesses, whatever, that are so commonplace. But what no one seems to be able to wrap their heads around, often because they don't have the intellect to do so, mathematically and otherwise, and the calmness and time, is that, in my opinion, or more than opinion, these 500 odd diagnoses are all variations of anxiety issues. Hence, there have been books in the past. Rollo May was a psychoanalyst. He wrote a book, trying to think, for sure it was him, The Age of Anxiety. Freud always talked about anxiety. Some put down everything he says, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, unfortunately. But anxiety has always been a topic in Buddhism. They call it simply fear. And they focus a lot on the fear of death. And I even remember the movie What About Bob, wherein he kind of had a major breakthrough in life and claimed it was he was going to market his new view on death therapy. But what there's no discussion of whatsoever in U.S. psychiatry today is the leaving out of two small but huge, actually, things that really, if you wanted to talk about mental illness, ought to be the kingpins, really, and the rest chump change. That is sadism and sociopathy, and the whole issue being clouded of what even sociopathy is by the introduction of a competing term used upon basically the, quote, lower class, antisocial personality disorder, which always involves discussion of how this and that person broke the law and broke the norms of society, alternatively. But those norms being quite different for one group than another. And we all know that during Hitler's regime, for instance, there were many things legal, which one day after the Nuremberg trials were over, were termed no longer legal, but war crimes, in fact. And even the term sadism is a clouded term that simply used to be discussed by psychoanalysts as displacement. Coming home after a tough day at work and kicking the dog was the inevitably used explanation, but that goes far beyond that. And it was clouded by the term sadomasochism, too, to try and make it a sexual issue when really it typically had nothing to do with it unless it was going to be taken up in the sexual arena, which typically is not the way sadism usually plays out. And then as the genetic theory took over more and more, it's been said that an indeterminate amount of suffering is due to brain genetics. And this sent a can of worms, even to say then some people are oversensitive and others aren't, leaving things wide open, of course, as to whether someone who has been raped and wants justice in court, so to speak, could be counter-accused of simply being oversensitive, and that they simply ought to get over it. Of course, try telling someone considered wealthy that they're oversensitive for their home being burglarized and their TV set or credit cards and even identities stolen. This then, unfortunately, has been used all too often, I believe, to send certain people down the rabbit hole, including one's own children often, whereby their brains are blamed for the way they were raised or their environments or both. Hence the terms ADHD, bipolar, opposition defiance disorder, autism, and did I mention OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. This even sadly turning against the Native American Indian population, by which the National Institute of Mental Health has claimed that the Native American Indians have a drinking problem, alcoholism, in part due to genetics. And this indeterminate part then, as to the percentage they claim, making it impossible to render in a court any kind of compensation for the part not deemed, as they call it, genetic in nature. But nobody, and I mean nobody since, the 1950s, since Dr. Sheldon has addressed the ramifications of physical frailty, physical weakness by way of being a female or being an ectomorph, very tall, frail, or short. Only Dr. Goulston has ever addressed this, I think, as a psychologist, or maybe he was a medical doctor, in the book PTSD for Dummies. And George Carlin, the comedian, saying facetiously, but not so much facetiously actually, that if females were larger, it would be men who would be getting slapped around. So that's a very interesting concept then of the so-called genetic issues involved. And there's even one man, for instance, a doctor, a medical doctor, who talked of the so-called brain malady of schizophrenia and saying that there are 200 types of schizophrenia, which then totally obfuscates the whole concept of what he is even trying to address at a core level, like massive panic, massive terror over death, and any kind of mental discombobulation, as well as what I call premises that are misinformed or taught, even marketed later after one leaves the nest, so to speak. So this whole concept right here, a can of worms too. Next, there's a huge misconception in our society, especially as to what it is to be an addict. Always, it's typically termed those with chemical-based issues. But I've heard in movies and this and that, by the way, that it's the, quote, chemical-based addict, typically pilloried as an alcoholic, who does harm typically only to themselves, but not others. This being pointed out in two movies, Where the Heart Is, and one of the movies with Robert Redford, A Walk in the Woods, where he facetiously joked, writers simply prefer to blow their brains out or drink themselves to death. And in the movie Where the Heart Is, someone who perhaps had spent time in AA had said, we simply prefer to hurt ourselves. And there's no addressing then of what Dr. Ann Schaaf, who passed away a year or two ago, a Cherokee Indian, and spent time in Oklahoma. In her book, When Society Becomes an Addict, addressing a whole concept of what she calls process addictions. And I mentioned then in my clarifying language as issues of addiction to status, control, and a few others. Massive numbers of distractions, very expensive and frequently changing out. Then there's the downplaying of the whole concept of a lobotomy. The only time it's ever mentioned is with respect to surgical lobotomies or the former ice pick lobotomies, stopped in the 1950s most of the time as per the ice pick type. But nobody likes to talk of the use of chemicals to perform the same function and then call it medicine, and noting, by the way, it's rather more reversible, more and more all the time now, since tardive dyskinesia has largely been eliminated with the newer drugs, called the second generation antipsychotics. And as these come more and more into play, and the lobotomy action becomes more and more the norm, just like overweightedness, and the clothing industry and everyone else catering to this, it's no longer addressed as something you might have called being a zombie. It's simply taken up as the norm, and those not kowtowing to this new mode of living, in fact, sometimes termed mentally ill by way of being termed sometimes manic, in fact. When in the past, to have not been so would definitely been called non-labile and zombieism and repressed. No longer do we have that word, repressed. Next is no small concept, credentialism. There are so many movies, or rather videos, on this, but I think the basic way of conceiving most clearly is to listen to an hour-and-a-half long show on PBS about Martin Luther back in the 1500s, who essentially was talking about the first form of credentialism being the popes, the Catholic Church in general, the priests, who said because of their credentials regarding their supposed pipeline to knowledge and infallibility of that knowledge through affiliation to their view of God, the Catholic view, that they had it all right. And Martin Luther pointing out that the extent of the tentacles then into modern, or rather that time of society for centuries. And I maintain more and more all the time that this is the same now, only we have, maybe you could call it Popism Part 2 or Credentialism Part 2, wherein those who have the degrees, or the Mr. Bowtie guys, I would say, are the ones who have the supposed pipeline to knowledge. And when coupled with the adage of we care, and we're going to implement what we think is best due to our pipeline being the best pipeline by far, this raising some rather interesting hairy conditions, I would say, at the least. Next, I think we have a very inverted view of what love is. And the whole concept even of love makes the world go round, wherein we define love as simply what we feel like is loving, or love as doing things for people / giving things to people / curing diseases and what we call monetary poverty, as I would put it. But there's no discussion of love as acceptance, understanding, except by very few, like Dr. Gottlieb, or in a video by, I think the man's name was Jim Anderson, who did not have any significant degrees, I believe, in one of his videos, a TED Talk, entitled "Acceptance is the First Step to Love." Next, I would say we have a curious inverting, and Dr. Ann Schaaf has pointed that out too in one or more of her books, wherein virtuous things, virtuous aspects, I would call typically not using short-term expediency, especially excessively, is termed virtuous again, even deserving of medals, and their non-use, or what Freud would call the non-use of defense mechanisms, especially to an egregious or immature sense, as he called it, being termed pathological now. Ann Schaaf pointed that out very clearly, and so has Dr. George Simon Jr., a man in his 70s with a PhD in psychology who talks a lot of morals, and he wrote several books on this, including Character Disturbance, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. Next, I would mention that what we call prisons or correctional facilities or even training centers and workers for such solicited on signs in the front lawns of our county courthouses, and even I saw once a month or two ago on the back of a city bus with a sign asking for people to sign up, so to speak, for these positions, running what I would call not correctional facilities, but gulags, actually, or concentration camps even, given that so many people go down the rabbit hole eventually. I don't know what to call it otherwise. And in conjunction, too, with several concepts like the uneven administration of who goes and who doesn't, depending in large part on how much money you have for a good lawyer. The O.J. Simpson lawyer versus the pro bono or court-appointed lawyer. Take your pick. Into, as I mentioned earlier in this audio, the more finessed lawyer being able to apply a deterministic explanation, nuts and bolts, of how someone ended up a certain way as per being accused of anything at all. Whereas the person with the lower acumen mentally as a lawyer, only being able to argue in the most simplistic sense, and everything going it was by choice scenario. Hence, we even have people in the tabloids then talking about how they emerged from prison and say they made bad choices. Not to mention, some of the sentencings are so draconianly long, and typically for drug offenses of the chemical nature, but not the process addiction nature. So there are many crimes that go completely unaccused and get medals even, whereas the drug crimes, typically by people who only hurt themselves. Those are the chalk numerous numbers in prison. Interestingly, in my opinion, these being the most free-minded people, the most what they used to call countercultural people, and the rest not there. And so that's a very interesting set there, I believe, of people. Not to mention Germaine Greer, who has talked in England of issues regarding women's rights, if I don't have the better terminology right now, pointing out that in England, if you were to be accused as a married man of marital rape and convicted in a court of law by your wife, that you would spend a minimum of 6 years in prison. Her contention was this so-called marital rape, call it what you will, goes on right and left. And my point being that you can hardly scratch your nose without there being a law violated. And for what it's worth, Pat Robertson of the 700 Club, a Yale-trained lawyer, has basically mentioned the same thing too. We have way too many laws, and they're morphing into more and more each day. Many of them even partly regulatory offenses, where we have more regulations every year, making things more and more complex too. Of course, the finer lawyer would argue in a court of law that something was not, quote, marital rape, whereas the non-acumen lawyer, as I would put it, could not argue most anything except the name of the person he's representing or she's representing. Next, I find very curious the claim made that a certain group has its constituency on a very broad continuum instead of a very narrow continuum, and that some groups are clearly groups that are quite impactful in the negative direction, shall we say, towards some other people. And yet the argument typically made that the people in that particular type of group can't be accused of anything in particular unless a lot of details are ponied up, because it's said there's a huge continuum within these groups. But is there a large continuum within the Gestapo of World War II's Nazi era? Is there a large continuum between the Mafia in Sicily, a group? Was there a large continuum between the men of Al Capone's gang with the bootlegging in the Depression for alcohol? Good questions, I believe. Yet another concept. Mandatory education, I don't know what it is these days, till age 16, wherein some, the Amish, for instance, have said they don't want their children going past the 8th grade, and some saying that, and at least in my opinion, oftentimes mandatory education stripping a person of time and calmness for things that are very critical, such as observing, pondering, reviewing, discussing things on a slow-term basis over a cup of coffee or whatever. They called it chewing the fat. That type of matter. And we're not even talking then matters of what is taught, but the simple fact that maybe there are much better ways of learning and being taught something. Again, observation being strongly pushed by Schopenhauer, the philosopher, and the man who wrote Every Man His Own University. I'm trying to remember the name, Russell Wallace? But that not a commonplace concept in print, but greatly so, I believe, amongst many in the rural areas in general. Seth Godin has written a book, by the way, that's downloadable, Stop Stealing Dreams, or something to that effect. I have not read it yet, but printed it out. Might be along these lines. Next, I alluded to complexity and Jordan Peterson talking of it. Have you what you will on that. That's a rather partial view, I believe, of a bigger problem in our lives, as I'm outlining in my view. But regulatory complexity, I believe, is getting worse and worse every year. And the downsides to missing a performance, shall we say, of a regulation, or even exacting what's necessary regulatory-wise, can be problematic. For instance, half a year ago, I obtained a vehicle by way of transfer of title to me. It took 10 visits to 2 courthouses to effect that. And when you sign up for even a checking account, you don't know what you're signing away or incurring obligations to you, because it's all in fine print typically, and you're not going to bring a lawyer there to sign up for a checking account, are you? Yet another interesting concept, I believe, is when we talk of the liberal arts being taught in colleges, I think we're talking basically the people areas, not the money areas, not the, quote, hard sciences areas, and business, not a liberal art. And my contention is that the people areas are very, very complex to master or get headway on because of complexity, and our vocabulary itself very inept when it comes to describing and talking about people in general, and values, religion, sociology, anthropology, and so on. But my contention basically being along the lines of Schopenhauer in this regard, that we need much more mathematics and work on linguistics too, as he put it. But I believe there is almost no requirement for mathematics to any significant degree, and what mathematics is taken is simply memorized, and amounts to no more than a week's worth of memory of any particular concept, and basically that just a bunch of number crunching, like how to punch buttons on a calculator, versus the true aim of mathematics to promote the capacity to think complexly and with what I would call a higher order of thinking. My having quite a bit of mathematical training, I might add. I have studies in electrical engineering and 4 years part-time in mathematics 20 years later, additionally. So I would kind of equate this then to trying to train people in a setting for physics or theoretical physics, and saying to them that they only need a couple bunny courses in mathematics. Whereas, say, Stephen Hawking and Albert Einstein, who did heavy theoretical work in physics, or maybe we would call it the theory of time with Hawking, both had at one point in time to completely stop their work and invent a new form of mathematics, Riemann calculus amongst others, before they could proceed any further. And they already had a lot of mathematics under their belt as existing at the present time. So, you know, that's a big, big question in my mind then. Why is mathematics so soft-pedaled when it comes to the people areas and the resulting effectiveness of the concepts in all these areas being like mush, as I would call it, almost to the point I would say of by design. For otherwise, why would you ask to be cut up by a surgeon who spent a lot of time taking this and that liberal arts course, but only a couple weeks when it came to how to wield the scalpel? You wouldn't want a surgeon saying, well, I feel that I had to put a cut here, and I feel I had to put a suture here, and I feel I had to do it in a particular way. We would say, if that notion were also applied to building the Apollo spaceships that took us to the moon, that we would have seen all of them blow up, and we would never have gotten 10 feet off the launch pad also, in general. By way of saying, well, I just feel that this is the way to design a spaceship. One last point. I love nature, and yet, ironically, it seems to be very hard, unless you put in special effort, to go to nature as per quietude. I know when I was in my 20s in San Diego, I was a member of the Sierra Club Singles, and I preferred actually the noise. If was troubling to me to be alone with my thoughts, all alone in nature. And so I would always insist, for me, hiking in a pack. And I know at least one person who loves going to bird sanctuaries, but it's in a pack of 50 others, elbow to elbow almost, with their binoculars too. And I did my share of that 20 years ago, and when I went with the Audubon Society bird watching in a pack. Rather smacks to me of wanting to go out in nature for a big nature walk in the Alps with your boombox playing. And in fact, I was way out in the countryside a year ago, going to a wonderful nature sanctuary, and half a mile before getting there, way out in the country, someone was doing gardening on a Sunday on their plot of land with their boombox playing. And I remember too, when I was living in France, or rather Germany, for 3 years in my 20s, I once drove on the Autobahn across the border from Germany to France. And at the checkpoint where my credentials or the passport was checked, I was almost denied entry because my muffler had a hole in it, and they said it's producing too much noise. And I went a year ago to a nature sanctuary I thought was really out in the middle of nowhere, and I was going to film something, and all of a sudden at 7 p.m. there was a putt-putt go-kart checking the cattle and ruining, as I would call it, my video effort at that time. I was a little tweaked until I pondered that a little more. And you can't go anywhere without hearing a plane every 2 minutes, or jet, or helicopter, even in nature sanctuary areas. And my goodness, if a vehicle does not have, as a pickup truck or motorcycle, a muffler that is in a rear or has a hole punched into it by design, making a lot of racket, it seems then that is not in accordance with what the owner would want. And many even in society. I remember, for instance, reading lately that more and more helicopters are used supposedly as crowd control in urban areas for events. And it being said that the populace likes it, actually. Well, maybe they like the noise, and that's part of why a lot of people like Urbania more and more, for the chaos. And the noise, a big part of it, along with the rushing, in my opinion, and the overcrowding in general, as well as all the variety of distractions. Noting, I find it rather interesting to have watched an audiobook on TV by a man who became a minimalist, he stated, and then packed up and went to Tokyo to a tiny apartment where, in my opinion, there's a lot of distractors. You simply don't own them. So he didn't call that minimalism. And I also knew a man in his 50s who had a big heart attack and almost died. He, a lawyer, gave up the profession, and he was scheduled to fly to a South American country. I think it was Peru, where he said he was really going to indulge in a new way of living, tasting a whole bunch of foods of a variety of sorts. He said, inexpensively, to me, that's not exactly a way of minimalism either, even though it might cost less. I think I saw, in fact, at Walmart a year ago, there was a book on noise. I haven't read it, but way too many books I haven't read. I even own a book with the title Data Smog. So, at any rate, I think noise is not a small problem. Some may like it for a time, but in my mind, it's part and parcel of what we call the rat race. And it's a misnomer, I think, that we'd all like to get out of the rat race. Maybe we like the rat race, a lot of us, all too often. As per my final note then, the philosopher Camus, C-A-M-U-S, saying it's very difficult for people to live with their own thoughts in a room. And I'll just leave that at that. So those are my thoughts then on societal degradation. And again, I don't think it's a small set of issues, but because we lack, in particular, clarity. I like Brian Tracy's video on the 7 C's of success, amongst others of his. And the first point of his was clarity. And he said he spends like 4 hours a day either reading or jotting notes with a yellow legal pad. And I would say, how can you have clarity without both strong mathematical acumen, as talked of by some in the past, including Schopenhauer, the philosopher, and secondly, lots of reviewing. We haven't even had spaced repetition software to do this effectively and efficiently until 30 years ago, which then I availed myself of about 20 years ago quite heavily. So those are my thoughts then on this whole panoply of ideas here to ponder.